wait a few minutes and let the folks kind of load in here slowly, one by one as they do.
I can hear the scraping of chairs as people get settled in.
Silencing their cell phones, all of that.
Yep.
You know, I don't even know how to do that. I just picked up my landline and my cell phone, brought it to the bedroom and put a pillow over it. I don't even know how to silence it.
You're my kind of guy.
Yep.
All right, I want to welcome everybody to another edition of SIBA's Reader Meet Writer. My name is Wiley Cash. I am your host. I'm a New York Times bestselling novelist living here on the coast of North Carolina, and I'm also the writer in residence at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, and I am your host. SIBA is the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance, and this is an organization that represents just under 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. And perhaps you are at this event tonight because you found out about this wonderful book from one of those independent bookstores. If that is the case and you're considering ordering this book, please order it from the bookstore that brought you here this evening. They are the lifeblood of our literary and cultural communities, and they need our help now more than ever, and our support. Normally, these two gentlemen would be at a bookstore near you, and you would all be finding your seats now and silencing your cell phones and taking a last-minute bathroom break or whatever it is you do before events. But we can't do that because of COVID. So we're doing the next best thing, and we're bringing these events to you virtually. We've been doing them for just about a year, and they've been enormously successful because so many stores and so many readers are continuing to support them, both in person, well, virtually, live, and online on our YouTube channel. I want to let you all know about a really exciting event that we have coming up on June 3rd. We'll be hosting musician and debut novelist Will Johnson, and I'll be in conversation with Will to discuss his new novel, If and When I Call. You may know Will Johnson as the founding member of Centromatic, that 1990s alt-rock Americana band from Denton, Texas. He's also been an important player in bands like Drive-By Truckers, Strand of Oaks, Monsters of Folk. He's got an incredible musical reputation, and he's also a great writer, and he's a prince of a guy. So we're going to have a great time. That'll be Thursday, June 3rd at 7 p.m. So please tune in for that event. Maybe will play a little music for us, but we'll definitely talk about the book. Tonight, we are thrilled to be hosting Bob Drury and Tom Clavin. If you have questions for these two guys at any point during this evening, go down to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and ask your question there. I will ask these gentlemen at the end of the show your question. So make sure you mention your name and the name of your independent bookstore when you leave your question. And you don't have to wait. You will not be interrupting the show by asking it during the show. Just go down to the Q&A, type it in, and we'll get to it at the end of the show. So right now, I want to introduce tonight's guest. Tom Clavin is a best-selling author who has worked as a newspaper and website editor, magazine writer, TV and radio commentator, and reporter for the New York Times, covering entertainment, sports, and the environment. Bob Drury has been nominated for 3 National Magazine Awards and a Pulitzer Prize. He's reported from Iraq, Afghanistan, Liberia, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, Darfur, and other sites. These two have teamed together to publish a number of best-selling books, and tonight, they are with us to discuss their latest book and instant New York Times bestseller, Blood and Treasure, Daniel Boone and the Fight for America's First Frontier. I will turn it over to you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wiley. Thank you for the most generous introduction. And Tom, do you ever notice how I sound like Susan Lucci? Nominated 3 times, nominated 1 time, never won the damn things, but I've nominated. Anyway, thank you, Wiley, for that generous introduction, and thank you to the Southern Independent Booksellers. We are friends of independent booksellers. Independent booksellers have always been so good to us, and we'll do anything we can to help independent booksellers. I guess I'll start it off just by, listen, the guy's name is in our subtitle, Daniel Boone and the Fight for America's First Frontier. So let me start off by dispelling a couple of myths about Daniel Boone. First of all, Daniel Boone did not die in the Alamo. That was Davy Crockett. You wouldn't believe how many people ask us about Daniel Boone's demise at the hands of Santa Anna and San Antonio. No, 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 no. And the second is that Daniel Boone hated and never wore a coonskin cap. He felt he was an average height man for his era, 5'7", 5'8". But his cousins on his mother's Welsh side were all giants for the time, 6'2", 6'3", 6'4". And he always felt he was short and had a stigma about it. And he felt a coonskin cap would make him look short or shorter than he felt he looked. And for this, Tom and I blame Walt Disney, who cast the actor Seth, I forget Seth's last name. Seth Parker, right. Seth Parker as both Boone and Crockett in his wonderful world of Disney TV series in the 50s and 60s. So one other thing I'll just bring up right now is that in Blood and Treasure, Tom and I did not intend on writing a biography of Daniel Boone. In fact, we don't think we have written a biography of Daniel Boone. What we hope we have accomplished is written a biography of an era, a 70-year span in the 18th century when this country, 13 colonies clinging to the eastern seaboard, first felt the stirrings of what would come to be known as manifest destiny, a term that was not coined, as a matter of fact, for another 50 years. But Boone, when we set out on this project, Boone was not even on our radar. I mean, I remember, Tom, we were looking at Indians, we were looking at Brits, we were looking at Frenchmen, but Boone was just everywhere. Everywhere we turned in our research, as we got deeper and deeper into it, there was a Boone.
Boone was not yet correct, a twinkle in our eye. My recollection is that in the very early conversations we were having about this book, the idea that we had is we were drawing a connection to the heart of everything that is. And some of the people listening to us now, and certainly some of the booksellers may still remember that was the story of the Sioux Indian leader Red Cloud, and had that very striking cover of the image of Red Cloud basically staring out at the reader. And that story was mostly taking place in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870. And it was like the last war, certainly the only war that a Indian leader won against the U.S. government. And it was the last of the Plains Indians. That, yes, there would still be Little Bighorn, but for the most part, it was the end of an era, of that particular era of the Plains Indians. And our conversation centered about, well, how did it begin? We've written about how it ended, but what about how it began? How is that blueprint established, where you had white explorers and hunters and then settlers who were working their way west, first started working their way west, encountered Indians. There would be bloodshed because of the inevitable fighting that occurred between them. There would also be Indian deaths because of disease. They had very little or no immunity to some of the white men's diseases that they brought with them, like smallpox, for example. And then they would either be domesticated, so to speak, or they would be moving themselves or being pushed farther west. And so that was our original thought about this book. We wanted it to be very much Indian-centric. Their story about how the template was first created that would last for the next 100 years. And our original thought was, and Bob probably remembers some of these Indian figures better than I do, but could we find somebody like Tecumseh? Could we find somebody like Cornstalk or Hanging Maw, some Dragging Canoe, some of these Indian leaders who would
Pontiac. Remember Pontiac?
Pontiac, yes, it was Pontiac Rebellion was a very significant year there in 1763, if I remember correctly. But could they guide us through the story like Red Cloud had guided us through the heart of everything that is? But their careers were short-lived, and what we kept finding as we were doing more and more research is Daniel Boone kept popping up. He was everywhere, and you could
go ahead. Yeah, you're right. Go ahead. I didn't mean to.
No, go ahead with that thought, because I know we talked about remarking to each other. There's that Daniel Boone again.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things about Boone, whether it was his the Long Hunters, whose heyday was only a 15-year heyday, but he was one of the earliest Long Hunters. He was like a Johnny, he was like a mythical figure, but he was real, a Johnny Appleseed, a Paul Bunyan. And I think, Tom, two things kind of surprise us. One was Boone's empathy, not sympathy, empathy for the indigenous people of the North American continent. He was a man of his time. He certainly fought Indians and he certainly killed his share of Indians. But he went to his grave rueing the fact that he was known as America's premier Indian fighter. He wanted to be known as a pathfinder, an explorer, a peripatetic forester, but he hated being known as an Indian killer, an Indian fighter. He thought the Indians were getting a raw deal, which was, when I say a man out of his time, I mean from the earliest stirrings in Massachusetts. We have the preacher, the famous preacher Cotton Mather, talking about the heathen sons of Satan, the heathen red sons of Satan, and even such luminaries as Thomas Jefferson, who proposed exterminating I put savages in quote marks, exterminating the savage tribes between the eastern seaboard and the Mississippi. But Boone understood them. He empathized with them. We're talking about Cotton Mather and religion. Boone once told his earliest biographer, uh, Filson, John Filson,
John Filson, yeah.
John Filson, listen, I'm not a religious man, but I hold the Indians' great spirit, or some tribes call him the master of breath. But I hold the great spirit in the same esteem as I hold the Christian God. And I just hope there's a way that the white race and the red race can learn to live together. Now, this was time out of mind for a man of Boone's era. I mean, it was, I believe one historian characterized it as most Indian relationships came at the end of a rifle, the end of a muzzle of a rifle. And Boone really understood, perhaps because he was such a forester, and he was. I mean, people looked at Boone, and a lot of the earliest settlers over the other side of the Appalachians, or the Appalachians, as it's known, as it should be known and called, as they were half tribal themselves. Easterners were like, these people are wild in themselves. So that was one surprise. How Boone's modern day sensibilities, I guess you would put it. And the other surprise, which I think knocked Tom and I both asunder, was what a key role that Boone played in the Western Front of the American Revolution.
Yeah, that was a very happy surprise for us because, I mean, we knew early on that this book, and we've had quite a few comments about it, was going to have a lot of action because there's a lot of conflict between the eastern settlers and hunters and explorers who went through and over the Appalachians and settled Ohio Valley, what's now known as Kentucky and Missouri and Tennessee, for example. There's a lot of conflict in the book, and some of it is rather graphic. But it was like icing on the cake to find out that Boone's military involvement went beyond fighting Indians. I mean, he has respected and admired the Indians, but it didn't mean he walked through the woods sprinkling posies. I mean, it was a case of survival of the fittest out there in the forest. Um, so there's a lot of action, but there was also Boone was part of the militia in Virginia, part of militia in North Carolina. The British and their Indian-led allies were trying to work their way through Kentucky, taking over the forts there, including Boonesboro, which was the most well-known of the forts in Kentucky. And
Sweeping down from Canada.
Yeah, and if they had managed to do that, their plan was, their strategy was, well, they would suddenly appear at George Washington's rear, and the Continental Army would be forced to fight a two-front war, which it was having enough time fighting one war on the East Coast, and then would suddenly have to fight two enemies at once. So that Boone was part of Revolutionary War battles, not just in 1777 and 78, but even in the Battle of Blue Licks, I think it was called, in 1782. where Boone lost the second of two sons that he lost in fighting. Um, that that arc of Boone's life that started in the French and Indian War and in the 1740s and 50s with Indians, going all the way to the beginning, the actual beginning of the United States, was very exciting to us. That kind of Forrest Gump-like figure kept showing up at these important events.
Forrest Gump, good way to put it. I would have put. I'm older than you, Tom. I would have said he was a Zelig type character. Uh, uh, Tom mentioned the violence. Our book is one reviewer who gave us a very nice review. He did say as sort of a caveat towards the end, like a movie rating. This book is not for the faint of heart. And one thing we were not surprised about was the violence, the carnage between the Native Americans who were here and the white Euro, and then later Euro Americans, and then later Americans, who, that's the treasure of our book. The treasure of our book is the native lands that the white people wanted. I mean, we were both well aware that whether it was the Jamestown settlement in Virginia with John Smith as in a leadership role, or whether it was the Pilgrim settlement in Massachusetts with Miles Standish in a leadership role, both Smith and Standish were soldiers of fortune. There was no coincidence that these people elected them or charged them with being in charge. I mean, we were just going to take this land no matter what. But I think that I mean, let's face it. Our narrative in Blood and Treasure opens with Boone's eldest son, James, 16-year-old son, bleeding out. He's gut shot. He's been ambushed by an Indian war party, a multi-tribal war party, Cherokee, Delaware, and Shawnee. He's bleeding out. He's going to die anyway. And the leader of this war party, Big Jim was his anglicized name, is plucking out his fingernails and his toenails before they scalp him and bash his head in. And it pretty much ends, or years and years later, with, Tom mentioned, Boone's another son, Israel Boone, dying in his father's arms. An Indian musket ball pierced his heart, and gouts of blood are spuming from his mouth as he tries to tell his father, "I love you." And in between the disembowelments, the scalpings, the burnings at the stake, it is not for the faint of heart. But I would like to point out, just before I throw it back to Tom, that the butcher's bill that I'm talking about went both ways. The white settlers were as vicious as any tribal torture could be. I mean, there were militiamen who would fall on peaceful villages and kill and just massacre men, women, and children. And there were even before the United States became the United States, there were English governor generals who would put out bounties, the equivalent today of $10 for a scalp for any man or woman, Indian woman over the age of 10. How they could deduce the age of the scalps, I don't know. It was a bloody, vicious. The historian Francis Jennings, who Tom and I both admire and relied on. Make sure I get this quote straight. Europeans did not conquer wilderness. They conquered Indians. They did not discover America. They invaded it. And this led, Tom mentioned before, our Red Cloud book, this was like rolling thunder across what is now the United States. And it started with the eastern woodland tribes, the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Kickapoo, the Ottawa, and in the South, the Cherokee, the Choctaw. And it perforce is a carnage-filled story, but it was a story that, I don't know, Tom, we felt we needed to tell. Just kind of set the record straight, right?
Well, we certainly felt we needed to tell it, but I think one point I want to make, and I know I don't want to intrude on the time that Wiley wants to ask us questions, but another enjoyable aspect of the book, and it sort of tempers a little bit the violence of it, is Boone was a very good companion. Now he was a good companion to his colleagues, his other hunters and explorers,
And to Indians.
and to Indians. But he's a good companion to the reader because he's somebody with a real good sense of humor, who also had very exciting dramatic adventures, and to some extent, kind of in a couple of cases, a modern sensibility. Certainly, his attitude towards Indians was he was a man out of time, and
Yeah.
Bob alluded to this, that he didn't have the kind of desire to kill Indians. He respected and admired them. But I would even say in modern sensibility when it came to the sexes, and a story, Bob knows the story I'm going to tell, and is that when Boone would go on these long hunts that would sometimes last 8 months, 10 months, 12 months, 14 months, the idea is coming back with pack horses laden with skins and pelts that could help his family survive and pay for things. And when he was gone an especially long time, he came back, and his wife presented him with an infant daughter.
He had been gone for 16 months at that point.
Now Boone was not a schooled man, but he could do basic math. And he realized there was no way, he was nowhere near his wife at the time of conception. So his wife fessed up and said, well, I thought you were dead. And your brother Ned and Daniel were almost like identical twins. They look so much alike. Your brother Ned was very kind to me. I'm here, a widow, I thought, with children on my own on the frontier. And Ned took care of me, and one thing led to another. And here's your daughter. Well, here's my daughter, and I hope your daughter, Jemima. And Boone thought about this a little bit, and he the two things basically he said was he realized that he had married a full-blooded woman, not a portrait of a saint. And the other thing is when he found out that Ned was the father, his brother, he said, okay, at least you kept it all in the family.
And that daughter, Jemima,
yeah,
was later kidnapped by another multi-tribal Indian party. Boone led the posse, for lack of a better word, that chased her on foot for 3 days and rescued her and two other girls. And in almost like an episode of Law and Order, 40 years later, James Fenimore Cooper ripped that story from the headlines, and he made it the centerpiece of The Last of the Mohicans. Remember this story? I think he changed it to, it was a British officer's daughter. But anyway, Wiley, I'm feeling that you're getting ready with the shepherd's crook to put around our necks. But I got Tom told that story, and it reminded me of one more story, one more humanizing story that I have to tell about Boone. When he was first leading the first foray, the first party into Kentucky. In fact, he was leader of what they called the Axemen, who were widening the trail, not for Conestoga wagons, but they were widening the trail through the Cumberland Gap so pack horse trains could get through. And one of the Axemen was this young Irishman. Will Hayes was his name. And there was one black female slave, and the only other woman on the expedition was Boone's daughter, Susanna. And Susie was what was known, how do I put this? Susie was a free-spirited woman. Let's put it that way. She was a free-spirited woman, maybe the first feminist west of the Appalachians. And anyway, at one point, Will Hayes, the Irishman, comes to Daniel, and he asks him for Susie's hand in marriage. And Daniel is like, oh man, was trying to convince diplomatically, as a father could, saying, maybe my daughter Susie's not a one-man kind of gal, but Will Hayes, of course, being a stubborn, blockheaded Irishman like myself, wouldn't take no for an answer. He eventually married Susie, and weeks after the marriage, he came back to Daniel Boone and he said, what do I do about, and this is another quote from Filson, what do I do about Susie's frolicking ways? I love that, frolicking ways. And Boone looked at Will Hayes, the Irishman. He said, son, I tried to warn you. Trot father, trot mother, did you really expect a pacing colt? And I mean, I guess this is the Daniel Boone. I mentioned Disney before. This is the non-Disneyfication of Daniel Boone. This is This is not the man that is glossed over in history class. This is not the man that we've seen in movies and TV. What we have hope, what Tom and I hope we have done, is portray Daniel Boone as a flesh and blood human being, as opposed to this mythic hero that he's considered. And Wiley, I saw you pop back on, and then you popped off, and now you're popping back on. So
I'm back. This is fascinating. We have some questions starting to load in, and I want to remind everybody, if you have a question for Bob and Tom about this book or any of the other many projects they've done together or even separately, go down to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type that question in there, and I will get to them in just a moment. But Bob, you were just mentioning, this is the reality of Daniel Boone, that kind of off-color joke, which is very funny. But why do you think we have so many lasting myths of Daniel Boone? And can both of you or either of you talk about the role of Daniel Boone in popular culture, the way that figure has been used politically, culturally, historically? I'm just interested in how he lives and how he has been used.
Tom, I think I might throw this to you because I think there's a connection between how the myth of Boone mushroomed, similar to how the myth of the Western gunfight and the gunfighters mushroomed. And with your gunfighter trilogy, with the Earps and Wild Bill and Bat Masterson, you would probably be able to explain better how this thing snowballs. Can I mix any more metaphors? Mushrooms, snowball, but you know what I'm talking about. What do you think?
I think Boone is one of the first examples, and possibly the first example, of how the I don't want to use the word media or the press, whatever, the popular press at the time, especially on the eastern side of the country, sought to do stories about these heroes of the West that they would hear things about. So you would hear something that's actually a true story. For example, Bob mentioned it before. This when Boone's daughter and these two sisters who were friends of hers were kidnapped, and there was this amazing trek that lasts for days to hunt them down and rescue them from the Indians and bring them back alive and in one piece. That was true, and it's an exciting chapter in our book. But that was not enough for the hungry maw of the minds of the people, especially in the East Coast. So we'd see as the years went on during Boone's lifetime, and certainly after he was dead, illustrations done in which he's fighting off a bear and an Indian at the same time, and all these kind of mythical. I mean, Boone was a legend in his lifetime. It wasn't like he was an obscure person that was discovered later. I mean, he was a well-known person.
He didn't die young.
No, he didn't die young. He lived to be almost 86 years old, and he became like the representative of the brave explorer who was opening up America to hordes of people that were flowing through the Cumberland Gap. So Boone was someone who, as the decades went by, his real life achievements were embellished, and so in some cases things were just completely fictionalized. And we saw that pattern repeated over and over again with the people who came after him, with Davy Crockett, with Kit Carson, with Bat Masterson and Doc Holliday, and all the gunslingers there, John Wesley Hardin. So Boone, but it's a good question, because Boone may have been the prototype of that mythical Western figure.
Wiley, I would only add that there is also of the 330 million odd Americans, 46 million of them can trace their heritage to settlers and pioneers who came through the Cumberland Gap. Mm-hmm. So it does not hurt to think Daniel Boone opened up this West for me. And so this is the kind of person I am. This is the kind of family I come from. We all kind of make myths about our forebears, and if Boone is anyway connected to your forebears, so much the better for the myth making.
Yeah, and we have the questions, and I want to get to the questions, and I'm being a little bit selfish, but when I think about myths of the Mountaineer, and I've, from Western North Carolina, spent a lot of time in Appalachia, used to live in West Virginia. I feel like the myth goes two ways. We have the Daniel Boone myth of the rugged individual who can take care of himself, who can squat on the land and draw water from the stone. And then we've got the mountain yokel who needs the mining company to come in and take care of him and, build him a house and all of those things. And, we build fences around places like West Virginia. And were those myths alive and well in the way they are now? Because I feel like Appalachia as a region is blamed for so much, stereotyped so, wholly. Were those stereotypes and did the myth go both ways then, or were the Mountaineers these ascendant pioneer patriot kind of characters?
To answer your first question, most definitely. Eastern seaboard occupants, as I said, when Tom and I were having a conversation, they look down at the Westerners, and I'm not even talking about Appalachia. I'm talking about the Yadkin Valley and the Blue Ridge.
Mm-hmm.
Half savages themselves, clannish, tribal, and in a sense, they were clannish and tribal. Boone always put more stock in family, even though he was leery. I wouldn't say he hated, but he was very leery of politicians, and then he became one himself for a brief time. But it was always family first, and that segues into an answer to your second question. It had to be family first because the frontier, the borderlands were so violent that you could not count on Virginia Rangers or Pennsylvania militiamen to get you out of a jam. They would not be there fast enough. But if you were in trouble, if you were surrounded by Indians, or if you knew Indians were about to attack, yes, your family would be there first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Tom? You kind of agree with that?
I agree. I don't have anything to add to that. I think it's very true that the families had to rely on each other. I mean, it's telling that Boone lost 2 sons in combat because his sons would fight alongside their father, and unfortunately in 2 different battles, one died in each one.
We have a question / comment from Helen in Punta Gorda, at Copperfish Books in Punta Gorda, Florida. And she had a couple of comments. One is about, the role of history in our lives and the pressure / expectation to cover the breadth of history. And I'm wondering how y'all, the contemporary burden on historians is different than it was 5 years ago. I think the burden of the researcher and the historian is always changing. But certainly now, especially when you're talking about the opening of the continent to, Europeans and things like that. So I'm so interested, given Helen's her comment. Y'all were originally writing a biography of an era,
right,
as you said, and then you kept seeing Daniel Boone pop up. Yet you have really just a breathtaking array and chronicle of the Native American experience at this time as well. And was that something you always wanted to do, to kind of braid these 2 stories? It's not just about white settlers, it's about the continent at the moment.
Well, I think the answer is yes for 2 reasons. One, going back to something that we talked about before, we really wanted to do a book that returned us to where right at the center of the story is the Native American experience. We didn't want to have them just pop up as cameo players in this drama. We very much hope, and we've heard good feedback on this, that when you're reading about the characters who are Shawnee or Cherokee or Kickapoo or some of the others, Ottawa, that there is kind of a you are there quality to it, that you were describing that Indian village, and hopefully you feel like you're in that Indian village, and you know what an Indian village was like in 1760. How they dress, how they carry themselves, and things that fascinated Boone, I think, are fascinating to anybody. when you had these very proud people who, this is 100 years before they were ultimately defeated. So you're seeing a very different aspect of it. The second thing is that I think is that now I have to emphasize, I did not read David McCullough's book, The Pioneers, or Pioneers, whatever. No, that's Willa Cather, but The Pioneers. But I remember, and I purposely did not, because I did not want to. McCullough's so good that, and we're working on a book that's also dealing with pioneers to some extent in Indian
The
country.
old Northwest Territory, Ohio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, but I did inevitably read some of the reviews, and some of the pushback that McCullough got. And I'm not saying this as having read it, but I'm just talking about what I read about the book. Was that the point of view was of these pioneers who were discovering new land, and that's something we wanted to make sure that did not intrude on our book. Boone and the others are not discovering. I mean, Bob talked about that Jennings quote before. They're not discovering something that's nobody's ever been before. White men have never been there before, but for millennia, people, Native American, Aboriginal people, indigenous people have been there. So that was very, very important that when people read this book, that it's not at the end of it, they say, wow, I really got a sense of what that was like to be on the first frontier on the other side of the Appalachians in the 1700s. Not just that, boy, that Boone was a good character.
Sure.
I'll add one thing to what Tom just said, and to Helen's point. And we rely as much as possible on contemporaneous research. We feel that whether we're writing about World War II, whether we're writing about the Plains Indian Wars, or whether we're writing about the Eastern Woodland Indians, we try to get as close as we can to journals, diaries, newspapers of the day. And that cuts through a lot of the bourgeois, so to speak, what Tom was speaking about before about gunfighters and how the myths build up. If you're as close as you possibly can be to the research, the contemporaneous research, I think, not that was not sensationalized, but I also think that you're closer to the truth vis-a-vis that biography of an era as opposed to biography of an individual. So good question, Helen, because that's what we look for. There was a Lyman Draper who I don't know if he would have been able to do this book without him. He was Boone's near contemporary. He was late 18th, 19th century. He interviewed Boone's child, Nathan, the youngest child, Nathan, but he also interviewed a lot of Boone's compatriots. And I think he said he rode 50,000 miles on horseback. And then he got writer's block and he couldn't finish his book. But he's got thousands upon thousands upon thousands of papers in the Wisconsin Historical Society. And without those thousands upon thousands upon thousands of papers, I mean, Tom and I both know, like, sometimes you're dozing off, but then you come across this nugget like, wow, the Jemima story was true. She was kidnapped. So that kind of thing.
That's fascinating. We have a comment from Spence. Spence says, I was amazed to discover so many new words in this book. I think my wife and I have very good vocabularies, but I identified over 75 words I had never been exposed to before. So that sounds like a compliment to me. But I want to end on this question from Charlene.
You're giving me a chiaroscuro of fog. It's a twilight between us now. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Charlene, I want to get us off on this question as we close out tonight. Charlene asked, did Daniel Boone's Quaker roots have any influence on his frontier life? And y'all talked about the way he viewed Native Americans, his perception of women, and what measure of quality his contemporary environment allowed him to take on that. But did Quaker beliefs influence any of that?
That is a very good question. By the time that Boone was, say, an adolescent and a teenager, I don't think there was any much Quaker influence going on, because his father, Squire, had pretty much separated himself from the Quaker organization and the Quaker.
I think it was the other way around, Tom.
Well, they wanted to get rid of him because the two of his children had married outside the faith. But it seemed like it was kind of mutual. Like, okay, you don't want us, fine. We don't want you. We're out of here.
Squire also enjoyed a bit of corn liquor at the time, too.
Yeah, that was also excommunicatable. You do have to wonder if having been, the next generation of Quaker Boones, if there was almost like something in his DNA that meant that he wasn't as aggressive as some of his peers, that he didn't see violence as a solution, that he wanted to get an understanding of other people. And that's a good question, because there may have been some of that in his makeup that he might not even have acknowledged himself. But I think it's one of the reasons why he did try to treat. I mean, he followed the golden rule, basically, even no matter what the other color of the person. I want to be treated the way, I'll treat you the way I would like to be treated.
Mhm.
And one thing people probably don't know, I was going to say people forget, but I'm sure they don't know. Boone did grow up on what were then the borderlands of Pennsylvania. Now it's kind of the Reading, Pennsylvania, is the eastern portion of the state. And William Penn was one of the, in fact, he was the only royal governor who tried to treat somewhat fairly with the indigenous tribes, particularly the Delaware, a bit of the Shawnee. And when Penn was the only royal governor who did not stand up a militia to fight Indians. He tried to buy Indian land, and standing by his side when he did all this was Daniel Boone's grandfather, George Boone, who was a very religious Quaker. So even though the religion might have seeped out of the family as it went down through George to Squire to Daniel, there was probably, as Tom said, there was probably some vestige of DNA in there.
That's fascinating. Well, this has just been so interesting, and I could listen to y'all talk about this all night. I can feel your passion for it and all the work that you did that went into it. And I would love to ask you more about your process and how you two work together. But instead, I will thank you both for coming and for joining us. And Bob, I wish you had a Daniel Boone in your life to take care of those squirrels you've got running loose in the house. Now is when he could come.
He's got Muskrat Jack.
Thank you. Yeah, I need a Kentucky long rifle.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us tonight. And I want to welcome you all back to join us on June 3rd. We'll be hosting Will Johnson to discuss his debut novel, If and When I Call. Until then, you can check us out on our YouTube channel, where you can see all of the dozens and dozens and dozens of Reader Meet writers we have hosted over the past year or so. But Bob, Tom, thank you both so much for joining us tonight. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.